Good evening, I'm Barkha Dutt. You're with the Mojo Story. We continue to keep an in-depth focus on the Prime Minister's visit to the United States of America, where at a meeting with Vice President Kamala Harris, there has been what India has called a suo motu raising of Pakistan's patronage for terrorism. Let's bring up our big story on the program today. Kamala Harris's message to Pakistan, according to India's Foreign Secretary, was a suo motu recognition of that patronage for terror groups. Speaking to the media, Foreign Secretary Shringla said that the Vice President of America agreed that what Pakistan was doing in patronizing terrorism could not impact American and Indian security interests. The Prime Minister is in the United States of America at a critical point when all manners of security concerns have been raised after the ascent of the Taliban in Afghanistan. There is, of course, also the meeting of the Quad, but there's also the AUKUS development, the alliance between the United States and Australia that is casting its own shadow. China, of course, continues to be the elephant in the room. But for India, what might matter most is how India responds to its concerns vis-a-vis Pakistan, especially given the situation in Afghanistan. So lots to discuss on this special broadcast. Let's introduce our panel of experts today. Joining us on the program, Suhasini Haider, who is, of course, a senior journalist with The Hindu. We're joined from Washington today by Seema Sirohi, a columnist and journalist, a veteran of this beat, among many other beats. Scott Lucas, a professor of American Studies at the University of Birmingham, is with us. And finally, we're joined by Ambassador Arun Singh. He's been India's ambassador to the United States of America and is presently a member of the National Security Advisory Board. Ambassador Singh, let me start straight by asking you, and we'll play out the Foreign Secretary's statement in just a moment from now. What do you make of the fact that there has been this sort of recognition of Pakistan's patronage of terror groups, but you would know that these are the kind of right noises that Washington has made over the decades? Is there anything that gives you hope that this time these words might translate into the kind of containment, into the kind of action that New Delhi and India would hope for?
From the Indian perspective, it is important that they heard this from the US and they heard it directly from the US Vice President, because it's the first positioning on the issue after the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Because many are now trying to figure out how would the US position itself with respect to Afghanistan, Pakistan, the issue of terrorism. Because the other area of concern has been that traditionally the US has been focused on what they call the global terrorists. The terrorists who attacked the US, who attacked Europe, and even in the agreement they did with the Taliban, it was a question of not attacking the US and its allies. And therefore, it would be important that those whom they see as local terrorists, who are carrying out attacks only in the region, that they do not go out of US focus. And I think the Vice President articulating that terrorism attacking India, terrorism attacking US are both matters of concern for the United States. I think at this stage is an important positioning on this issue and certainly a reassurance to India. But again, I don't think we should overinterpret it too much, because Pakistan has been saying for a long time that US has been saying for a long time that Pakistan has been involved with terrorism, has been involved with terrorist groups. You may remember that way back in September 2011, the then Chairman Joint Chiefs of Staff said in a congressional hearing that the Haqqani network was a veritable strategic arm of the ISI. And now Sirajuddin Haqqani is an integral part of the Taliban government in Afghanistan. So that issue is there. And the US has a certain dependence on Pakistan. Earlier, the dependence was because they needed to supply the troops. Today, the dependence will be because the US is looking at carrying out over-the-horizon counterterrorism action in Afghanistan. Now, if you're doing over-the-horizon counterterrorism action, one, you may need some inputs from Pakistan, who has a presence on the ground, and also your drones, if you're going to take action, have to overfly Pakistani territory to go into Afghanistan. And therefore, you need approval and concurrence of Pakistan. So to that extent, the dependence on Pakistan will continue, and that will impose some limits. And also there's been concern in the...
Sorry, I was just going to ask you on that point that I don't know if I'm being I don't know if I'm being somewhat cynical, but given this dependence on Pakistan, I mean, how much can you really expect the United States to do, especially if it looks to Pakistan to play interlocutor with the Taliban, as it were?
So I think, that, as I said, there will be a limit to the kind of pressure they can generate in Pakistan, also because they're concerned about stability in Pakistan. And they feel that if you push Pakistan too much, and that's the argument that Pakistan has made, there could be a terrorism related blowback in Pakistan, or that the Pashtun dimension could play out negatively in Pakistan, destabilizing Pakistan, and they have concerns related to the nuclear weapons in Pakistan. But that having been said, they also recognize that if they're not firm on the issue of terrorism, eventually there is a blending happening between the local terrorists and the global terrorists, and they support each other. And then terrorism will grow in the Pak region that will hit the United States. And you have seen reports from the US intelligence community and the UN saying that the Taliban has not broken its links from the Al Qaeda and other terrorist groups. And that's coming up time and again. So there is a concern in the US, but so they will play this delicate game of generating pressure on Pakistan, but not wanting to lose access to Pakistan and through them to Afghanistan completely. But again, as you see, they're trying to use Qatar more and more because they want to reduce the dependence on Pakistan.
Okay, I just want to at this point play out what the Foreign Secretary said, and then I will open up the conversation for the panel. We have the Foreign Secretary's account on what the American Vice President Kamala Harris said about Pakistan's patronage for terror groups.
In that context, when the issue of terrorism came up, the Vice President suo moto referred to Pakistan's role in that regard. She said that there were terror groups that were working there. She asked Pakistan to take action so that these groups do not impact on US security and that of India. She agreed with the Prime Minister's briefing on the fact of cross-border terrorism and the fact that India had been a victim of terrorism for several decades now, and all the need to rein in and closely monitor Pakistan's support for such terrorist groups.
Okay, let me take this now to Seema Sirohi and Suhasini. Haider, especially as journalists covering these meetings, Seema, there's a sense of deja vu every time you hear an American leader get up in Washington or, and say, hey, this is what Pakistan does. And then nothing very much happens after that, in part because of, America's own transactional relationship with Pakistan. For all these decades, the supply lines for the NATO troops through Pakistan into Afghanistan was cited as a reason for that dependency. Even with the American exit now, we're now seeing, as Ambassador Arun Singh said, a new kind of dependency shaping up. So how much importance should we really attach to this suo moto referencing by Kamala Harris on terrorism in Pakistan? Seema, you first.
Well, I think we've seen this movie so many times before that I tend not to get excited. And Kamala Harris raising this issue suo moto is mainly, I think, to sort of check a box with the Indian side, to please the Indian side to some extent. There is going to be a review. Secretary of State Antony Blinken promised that during the congressional hearings on Afghanistan recently. But I'm not holding my breath, because a combination of geography and ability to blackmail the Americans has served Pakistan so well over the past 2 decades that I've been here. And the Americans fall for it every time. They don't want to call Pakistan's bluff. And yes, they need staging grounds for their over-the-horizon operations. But surely the Pakistanis need the Americans a lot too. Why doesn't that part of the equation ever be leveraged? I don't understand.
Mm-hmm. And you see no reason for anything to shift. If anything, that dependency could increase, Seema?
We don't know just yet. They're talking to a lot of people. They're also in talks with the Russians about Afghanistan. So I think Blinken is exploring different countries, Central Asian countries, etc. We don't know what will come out of it, but yes, Pakistan has the ace in hand.
Pakistan has the ace in hand is not, of course, how any government would want to describe it, Suhasini, but something that perhaps hasn't been reported on enough, is Antony Blinken's statements on being in a deep discussion with India on these sort of staging bases for the over-the-horizon activity, as it were. Now, we don't know if India will say yes. We haven't really had any official response to this. Do you think if we do say yes in this altered sort of security situation in our neighborhood, it would alter fundamentally the Indo-US equation, Suhasini?
Okay, firstly, Barkha, I'm not sure that it was Antony Blinken who said it. He was in that House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing, and he was asked, would the US consider talking to India? Was the US talking to India about these over-the-horizon possibilities for strikes, which would be based out of India? And he said, this is not a conversation I would have at a public forum, essentially saying, these are, strategic matters. These are classified. This is classified information. When we asked the Ministry of External Affairs, the spokesperson actually said, you've misread what Mr. Blinken said. It is important that neither side has outright come out and denied it, but I'm not sure that there is really, in strategic terms, a basis to say that India would provide those kind of bases for the US, particularly when it comes to Afghanistan, because India does not actually have control of the entire airspace all the way to Afghanistan. So there are only three ways those could actually be staged via Iran, via Pakistan, or via China. I don't think any of those options works. I think the US has more possibly viable options from West Asia, the Middle East, if it chooses to carry these out. But I do want to ask there, Barkha, what over-the-horizon attacks is the US talking about? They promised them to President Ghani when they said that if the Taliban tries to take over Afghan cities, there will be these over-the-horizon attacks. We will stop the Taliban from taking control of Afghan cities. They never carried out those strikes. There was, I think, 1 or 2 strikes right at the beginning, and then there was one which turned out to be a false intelligence where they bombed a family, essentially in retaliation for the airport attack. I haven't seen these over-the-horizon strikes actually carried out. Over the last 2 years, the US has been in touch not just with Pakistan, but with the Taliban very clearly. They've been part of the Troika Plus, US, Russia, China, with Pakistan. I'm not sure if we're making too much out of what the US hopes to do with India. If it hasn't done anything with India for the last 20 years, when it comes to Afghanistan, I find it very difficult to believe that suddenly the US is going to find India's utility in dealing with Afghanistan. I think it's much more likely that it is the Indo-Pacific that the US is focusing now on, and pulling out of Afghanistan, in a sense, frees up the US a little more to focus on that.
I mean, I asked the question, but actually I agree with you. I asked the question because there's been so much focus on it, but I do want to shift the conversation to the Quad and what we can really expect from it. But Ambassador Singh, I do want a brief response on the sense that you get from both Seema and Suhasini about a kind of deja vu moment, a kind of staleness to this tick in the box, as I think Seema said, recrimination, as it were, about Pakistan. And so what? I mean, if we were sort of talking realpolitik, we would say the Americans are out. Yes, they may be sort of looking at Qatar to replace the role that Pakistan typically enjoyed. But, at the moment, as Seema said, we've not seen any signs that there's going to be a shift in that Pakistan policy. Arun?
So, Barkha, as you know, US has struggled with how to approach Pakistan, and they've struggled between incentivizing Pakistan and pressurizing Pakistan. And there are phases when they put them under pressure. There are phases when, for example, when Richard Holbrooke was the special representative, his whole approach was that you can get more out of Pakistan by engaging with them. And I remember between 2009 and 2010, and I was assigned at the US, in the US at that time, the Obama administration asked Kayani several times, what do you need which will enable you to work with us more in Afghanistan? And he gave 3 different sets of papers. And eventually none of that worked because there is a strategic sort of non-convergence between what the US and Pakistan wanted in Afghanistan. And the relationship even survived Osama bin Laden being found in Abbottabad. So I think there is this dilemma that the US is facing. And if you look closely at what Tony Blinken said, the first part was that we will need to evaluate what has happened in the US-Pakistan relationship. And the second part, we need to see what we should do to get them to do what we want. Now, that is exactly what the US has debated for a long time. Sometimes give them more money, sometimes sanction them. And what approach they will take now will depend on, one, how much will they need Pakistan in case in the context of counter-terrorism action within Afghanistan. And I think their assessment of how much can they push Pakistan before Pakistan pushes back or it leads to instability in Pakistan. So my own sense is that whatever pressure the US generates, I think Pakistan will probably be able to bear that. And from time to time, as they have done in the past, they will give US some successes. They'll find some people involved with the Al-Qaeda, some people involved with ISIS-K, that they will work with the US intelligence to go and target them. And the US will say, some elements in US administration will say that, look, we are getting some cooperation from Pakistan and therefore continue with that link.
Yeah, and I think it's either way, it's not a happy situation, I guess, for India. But let's look at then what happens with the Quad, if anything happens at all, where obviously the unspoken sort of aim is to contain China. Scott Lucas, I know you've done some sort of research in this space. Let's bring you in at this point. There are those who would argue that the Quad has been shadowed, though our government has said that the two are not related, with what's happened between the United States and Australia. Go ahead and respond to how you see the efficacy of the Quad.
Well, first, if I could contribute to this valuable
Please.
conversation on the US and Pakistan, it's very interesting today looking at the American briefing on what happened between Prime Minister Modi and Vice President Harris, because it is very different from what is being presented by the Indian side. The American side, first of all, the New York Times and Washington Post, I can't even find a word about the meeting in those leading outlets. But when you do see the meeting discussed in Al Jazeera or in the Los Angeles Times, the American emphasis is that Kamala Harris raised the necessity of democracy. Now, that is an implicit statement about Indian internal affairs. And
can you hang on just a second? Because we do have that statement of the Vice President. I kept it for a different part of the program and our conversation. But since you brought it up, I think it's important to play it out and then you can build up on what you want to say. So we did see a referencing from Kamala Harris on how it was important to strengthen democratic institutions at home for both India and the US, seen, as Scott Lucas is saying, by the American media at least, as a gentle nudge to India on the internal situation. Let's listen in.
Finally, as democracies around the world are under threat, it is imperative that we defend democratic principles and institutions within our respective countries and around the world, and that we maintain what we must do to strengthen democracies at home. And it is incumbent on our nations to, of course, protect democracies in the best interest of the people of our countries.
All right, go ahead, Professor Lucas.
So you'll know that there have been members of Congress as well as activists who have been telling the administration, you need to raise the issue of the Modi government's relationship with non-Hindu groups. You need to raise the issue of the Modi government's approach to journalists, for example. And that, in effect, is what Kamala Harris, who is of Indian descent, has done. So that's getting the attention when Americans are noticing what's happening so far, rather than the Pakistan dimension.
Can I though say to you that it would be quite normal in diplomacy for countries to take away what they consider more important, and perhaps there would have been more than a gentle nudge from the Americans if the situation in Afghanistan were not as sensitive as it is. And given that the security situation has become paramount, it's my reading, and I'll ask the panelists about this, but to you first, Scott, that the Americans can't afford maybe at this point to overemphasize this dimension too much. Everyone's got too much else on the plate.
That's exactly right. But they can't overemphasize the Indian internal issue too much, not because of Pakistan and Afghanistan, but because of China. If you look at Pakistan media, by the way, today, notice that their lead story is not about Harris and Modi, it's about Anthony Blinken. And their line is, he sees common ground with Pakistan and with China on the approach to the Taliban. Now, that's a very different reading from what we're getting here. But here's the fundamental. The reason why India is valuable to the Biden administration right now is not because of Afghanistan and Pakistan, other than just not causing trouble there. It's because the Biden administration is trying to link the Quad, India, Japan, and Australia, with the Australia, UK, US deal for nuclear submarines. The idea that one, after Afghanistan, we rebuild alliances, and two, the foremost point of those alliances is China. But that causes problems for India because they don't see Australia, UK, US fitting in alongside the Quad.
Okay, I think you've given us something to take forward, and I want to bring in Seema Sirohi at this point. Seema, if I can bring you into this conversation, I think that for someone like you who's tracked this relationship for decades, there's a belief that the Democrats will lecture to India on human rights, on democracy, much more than the Republicans, and perhaps this conversation would have gone even sort of more differently had the neighborhood not been of such immediate concern. How did you see Kamala Harris's comments on democracy? Did you see it as a kind of generic motherhood and apple pie statement, or did you think it was specific?
I think it was checking a box, and that's about it. Under this administration, the whole idea of approaching human rights and democracy has evolved, I think. If you listen to the statements made by Blinken and others, they say that democracies are works in progress, and everybody is struggling for, quote unquote, that perfect union. And it is in this context we should look at it. I know the professor thinks that the New York Times didn't even make a mention of this meeting, but then that's the nature of the business. There are a lot of stories going on. So the meeting not being mentioned by the Times or the Post, that doesn't mean anything.
And that used to happen even before.
That's
not specific to this trip. Yeah.
Right. That's not relevant. LA Times mentioned it because she's from California. The point is also one additional point that perhaps she mentioned democracy and human rights because perhaps Biden will not. They're checking the box, and that's it. At this time, against the background of Afghanistan and what has transpired there, how can the Americans come down on anyone, hammer and tongs? They cannot. They cannot afford to. They have abandoned an entire set of people, the women and the people who worked for them. They're being targeted by the Taliban. So this conversation about democracy and human rights should be seen in the context of what's happened domestically in America. It's a work in progress, for sure. For the past few years, you can see that.
I think, Suhasini, that's an interesting point, that the moral force that the Americans would have liked to allocate for themselves has been greatly diminished by the clumsy handling of what's happened in Afghanistan. And therefore, I would tend to agree more with Seema than with Professor Lucas with respect to the professor, that this seemed just that box ticking, like as did, by the way, the comments on Pakistan. I'm not saying I'm picking up one and making much of it. I think there was a lot of box ticking going on there.
Well, certainly, but the truth is that Kamala Harris has stood out. She has stuck her neck out in the past when it comes to issues of democracy. And here we can't completely wipe out everything that has been said before the Democrats came to power. What they said when Prime Minister Modi went to Houston and said, "Ab ki baar Trump Sarkar," and most of the Democrats who had confirmed that they would attend that public rally, the joint public rally between Prime Minister Modi and then President Trump, actually backed out of attending that event. Subsequently, Kamala Harris on Twitter criticized External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar for boycotting a meeting in which her fellow Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal was supposed to be there. Kamala Harris also criticized the Indian government over the Delhi riots and criticized President Trump for not having spoken more about the fact that those riots happened while he was in Delhi. So this is where Kamala Harris is coming from. So to expect her not to mention democracy at all would have perhaps been futile. I think it is true that the Democrats have approached their problems over democracy, human rights, the treatment of NGOs, the problem of press freedom, all of these from the point of view that America is not perfect. It is also a work in progress. And therefore, they have expectations from India. They have expectations from themselves. But I think it wouldn't be possible to put aside the kind of focus that is being put on democracy. After all, if the Quad is being promoted, it is being promoted as a coalition of democracies. If President Biden is speaking again and again about democracy in every one of his statements, it's because it's leading up to his plans for a democracy summit. When he became president, he made the point that it wasn't just countries that were authoritarian that were the problem, but the places where democracy was failing that were the problem, the places that were going backwards in transition, if you like. So these comments will be made. I think the Indian government has learned to live with them, frankly. They realize that if it's just a statement or some condemnation from the US Commission for International Religious Freedom, this doesn't really affect anybody. I mean, what does the US do besides make these statements about democracy, and then they continue business as usual? And you know, when you are going to put countries in some kind of category, Myanmar has seen a complete change. The junta took over in February. They put the entire democratically elected government in prison. Now, from February to September, we haven't seen the US really do too much. They may make a few statements and get upset, but it hasn't really changed the dynamic. You know, there are other countries around the world, and I know everybody talks about Saudi Arabia, but China, all the rest of that, it doesn't go beyond this what Seema calls, you know, checking boxes, and also just basically lip service. There'll be a lot of it. The question is, how uncomfortable is India itself with the way matters are proceeding inside India? What the US decides to do about it, frankly, I think it's irrelevant.
Let me take that to Ambassador Arun Singh. Would you agree that there's a less there's less prickliness over these kind of comments now?
Prickliness, and I think the way Vice President Kamala Harris has done it, it enables different people to take away differently from that statement. I think as far as the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is concerned in the US, the issue has been raised. And then, those who are critical of the government in India would say, yes, that point has been flagged. Others would argue that she has also criticized and drawn attention to the challenges being faced within the United States: systemic racism, voter suppression, and what kind of thing that the Republican Party under Trump is standing for in terms of denial of facts and election victory denial. So the US itself is facing a lot of challenges. And you may remember, even during the campaign, Tony Blinken and others had said that even when we raise the issue related to democracy with India, it will be like a dialogue among friends. But also, as the point was made just now, with what has happened in Afghanistan, there is a lot that the US itself has to answer for. So certainly, I mean, this is an issue that will be discussed. And as has been pointed out, that one effort being made to consolidate the relationship between US, India, Japan, or Australia is also on the platform of shared values, democracy. And the Prime Minister, in his own comments, standing along with Kamala Harris, referred to convergence of values and beyond the convergence of geopolitical interests. So I think people are working around this. And certainly, I think there is less prickliness. And then the US Commission on International Religious Freedom and others, as Suhasini, you and Seema would recall, has been critical of Indian government way before the present government came in 2014. And we saw the challenges from them even earlier.
Fair enough. So I want to spend the last few minutes talking actually specifically about the Quad and what's happened with Australia and the United States of America. Let me start with you, Ambassador Singh, and then I'll come to Professor Lucas. What's the value of the Quad today, and do you believe it to be diminished by what's happened with AUKUS, that alliance between the Americans and the Australians?
So I don't believe it is diminished at all because, for one, India never wanted to be part of any military alliance, and that has been India's position. So the kind of alliance that US, UK, and Australia have brought about, I mean, that was certainly not on India's horizon. The second aspect is the US has always been talking about networks of security architecture in the region and not one security architecture. And India itself has a dialogue going with India, France, Australia. They have one with India, Australia, Japan. India is also a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It is a member of the Russia, India, China framework. It's a member of BRICS. So I think there is no expectation that just because there is a particular format for discussion, it excludes the possibility of any other format coming in. We have to accept that arrangement. And as far as the Quad itself is concerned, clearly the US is attaching a lot of importance because they recognize the value that Japan and India bring to this equation. The very fact that Joe Biden, the first multilateral summit he did was the Quad summit, and now he's doing an in-person meeting of the Quad, is a reflection of the importance they attach. And in terms of the Quad, I think each country is trying to see, one, what is the benefit they derive from membership of the Quad? For India, in terms of technology access, in terms of enabling strengthening of other partnerships, supply chain resilience, and also what is the benefit that they bring to other countries in the region who are occasionally suspicious of Quad or critical of Quad like Russia and China. And hence the focus on vaccines, focus on climate action, focus on new and emerging technologies. So I would say Quad is here to stay and it has its own role.
Okay, Professor Lucas.
Well, I mean, I would start by introducing the Quad by saying this is the foremost issue for the Biden administration. This is their priority, which is why, just to clarify, I wasn't saying that an emphasis on democracy inside India is a priority for the administration. It is a bit of box ticking, but it is a bit of necessary box ticking. With regret, human rights is not really high on the Biden agenda, but at the same time, and this issue of terrorism that you're talking about, unless there is a terrorist incident, and then it might shift. But what does the Quad mean? There are 2 points I want to put up for discussion. The first is that the Australia-UK-US agreement, not necessarily the agreement itself, but the manner in which it came about could be destabilizing. We know it has been destabilizing with other American alliances, particularly with Europe, not just with the French. But it's also possibly destabilizing because the question is, although the ambassador is right, you can have multiple agreements. How do you balance this agreement made without consultation of anyone but Australia and a country far, far away, the UK, which is a naval approach, with a land-based approach that India, for example, faces when it comes to China? And that raises the second question, is that India, as the ambassador mentioned, is in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It is in BRICS. It is in the Russia-China framework. What happens if the United States goes military first with the Quad? Not just supplying military technology, but says this is a military approach to China as well as an economic and a social approach. Can India, given the border issue with China and given its place in SCO, go along with that type of presentation by the US of the Quad? And I think we're going to have a lot of behind-the-scenes negotiations between India and the United States on how exactly to frame the Quad, not only practically, but the way that it's presented to the region and to the rest of the world.
Okay, let me take that straight to Seema and Suhasini, and then I'll give the ambassador the last word as we close. Seema, how has the Quad's significance been? I know Scott Lucas just described it as the priority of the Biden administration, but has it been? You're right there. Has it been somewhat diminished in the attention it's getting from the administration?
No, I wouldn't say that. But I would say that India will have questions because remember when the Quad was revived under the Trump administration and the document was revealed as to what they plan to do, Quad was the organization, the grouping that everybody was supposed to get excited about. Then out of the blue comes AUKUS. Perhaps, as Ambassador Singh said, that India has never been in favor of a military alliance or giving a military flavor to the Quad. So therefore, the Americans and the Australians decided that let's do this. net, it's a gain for India. Like if you have more maritime security because some more submarines will be patrolling the waters, that's all fine. But I think there are questions that right now are being papered over about how these two organizations will sort of interplay with each other.
Yeah. So Hasni, would you agree with that? That it's not very clear?
I'm actually going to disagree with everyone else on the panel because I do think that AUKUS has turned Quad into quite clearly Quad light. And the questions that have to be asked have to be asked for four reasons. Firstly, given that the US is a treaty alliance partner of both the UK and Australia, where is the need for AUKUS? Why are you building a new alliance when you already have treaty alliances with them? You could have had these agreements, defense partnerships, security alliances without necessarily making it about a new formation in the Indo-Pacific. Second, why did it have to be announced exactly 1 week before the Quad, making it very clear that they didn't decide to do it perhaps after the Quad, which may have taken away some of these misgivings that we have heard. The third, the idea that it is a nuclear partnership, that the US is giving Australia nuclear technology that it has not given others, that it has not given anyone since 1958 when the UK was given this technology. Fourth, why was it done so secretly that even France, that was already in negotiations with Australia for a different kind of submarine, was not aware of it? And then we have seen this kind of fragmentation in this Indo-Pacific coalition that India was hoping to do. So lots of questions coming up over there, and I think it certainly takes away from the attention on the Quad to look at exactly what this is. Of course, the French outburst is only added to the highlight, the Quad's limelight being taken away. But I absolutely think that the announcement of the AUKUS, the way it was done, and the fact that it is necessary today to talk about the AUKUS as a security alliance, as if to say the Quad is basically there to discuss climate change, COVID, maybe some infrastructure finance, which hasn't really worked out, something called critical technology and the resilience of supply chains, and other such issues. I do think that AUKUS will make a difference to the Quad.
I agree with you. And Seema, briefly, I know you're wanting to interject with a thought that the timing might be a perfect deflection.
Absolutely. I think the reason they announced it just before the Quad was to take the attention away from Afghanistan, which was a complete and utter disaster for the Biden administration. They are under pressure on domestic issues. They're under pressure on the border situation. The big thing that he did on foreign policy front was a chaotic, violent departure from Afghanistan. So then they did this. Then, lo and behold, the French got so upset. Even this execution of this great alliance was handled very badly. So the question arises, I mean, they may have good ideas, but the execution part, I think they need to think again.
Okay, I'm going to give the last word to Ambassador Arun Singh. If we do agree that the AUKUS has taken something away from the Quad, if we agree that a lot of the comments on Pakistan are ticking the boxes, what is the realistic expectation, the best case scenario from this visit? And this visit is a little more significant than a routine set of meetings, because we're living in such a dangerous sort of immediate neighborhood now because of what's happened in Afghanistan. Last word, Ambassador Arun Singh.
No, thank you, Barkha. So no, I think visit is important because it's the first time they're having a face-to-face meeting after Joe Biden became president. They've spoken on the phone, they had virtual meetings, but not face-to-face. And I think that's important in terms of building confidence. And India would certainly be looking at getting a deeper understanding on how US is going to approach Afghanistan post-Taliban takeover, because that is going to have a bearing on India's security. And here also from the president, that how are they going to deal with Pakistan and Pakistan's continued involvement with terrorism. Then, of course, on China, there would need to be because what we are seeing from the US, at one level, a signal that the posture on China would continue. And I think the reason the AUKUS was done, as Seema mentioned, was to signal that the US remains robust in its other foreign policy engagements, but also in his conversation with President Xi. President Biden said that we will compete, but we don't want to take it to the point of conflict. So how are they going to nuance the China relationship? Because that again will have a bearing on India. And then going from there, we will be looking at the bilateral aspects, defense cooperation. And one thing that has come through now repeatedly is cooperation in new and emerging technologies. And I think if we are able to build on that, that will provide an important foundation, a ballast to these growing strategic convergence between the two countries.
All right, we'll look closely at what happens at that meeting as well as what happens at the court. Thank you, Ambassador Arun Singh, Professor Scott Lucas, Suhasini, Haider, and Seema Sirohi. To our audience, have a great weekend, but we will be back tomorrow, same time. See you then. Goodbye.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.